Hello everyone. Today we're talking about the first 6 chapters of The Half-Blood Prince. You can see that I got the British version and everyone's looking very intense because things are getting grim in the wizarding world. So, today I specifically want to focus on redemption arcs. And those of you who are reading the series for the first time might want to skip this one, though if you've seen the movies you're probably okay to keep watching. I'm not going to go into specifics, but you will definitely be able to infer some things from what's going to follow. So, if you want to stay absolutely spoiler-free, you should stop now and maybe go watch one of the Potterwatches instead. Okay, I think it's safe now. So, the reading for today includes 2 opening chapters that aren't from Harry's perspective, and both of these contain humanizing portraits of some of our villainous characters. So I want to talk about the function of these chapters. So first of all, they're clearly part of the larger shift toward moral complexity that we see in these later books, which tracks also with Harry's increasing maturity. Because these 2 chapters don't include Harry, the descriptions aren't giving us his narrative perspective, so they're not evidence of his growing ability to see characters outside of a good-bad moral binary. But they do fit well with the Slughorn chapter, which is a great example of a character who doesn't fit neatly into one of these boxes that Harry used to sort characters into as a young child. The other thing that these 2 villain humanizing chapters do is put some pieces in place for redemption arcs. So I want to talk about some of the redemption arcs in the series more broadly. By the way, in case the term redemption arc is not familiar to you, it just means a storyline in which a villainous or antagonist character overcomes or atones for their flaws and becomes either a hero or, and this is more common in Harry Potter, they take some kind of significant action that helps the protagonist. The villains rarely become actual heroes in this series, and most don't actually atone for their actions, but many of them move into a relatively more acceptable, morally gray space that's maybe a more realistic and appropriate aspirational endpoint for characters who start off as pure-blood supremacists. The first thing to note about redemption arcs in this series is that not everyone gets one. And Rowling's allocation of redemption arcs to Slytherins / Death Eaters / people who've done horrible things doesn't always follow a clear pattern. It seems partially linked to eventually taking actions that benefit Harry, and it's often also linked to being motivated by love for another person, which doesn't have to be Harry, just someone besides the character themselves. And given that many of the characters in the series are Slytherins, we might see this redemption arc as a reward for rejecting a completely Slytherin worldview, by showing love and loyalty to another person, even when it's not strategic and self-serving. But, as I said, it's inconsistent. So let's look at a couple of examples, starting with Narcissa Malfoy. So, Narcissa is in deep with the Death Eaters. Her husband and her sister are among Voldemort's most fervent followers, and now her 16-year-old son Draco has been tasked with an important, but probably impossible, personal mission from Voldemort. She correctly intuits that Voldemort expects him to fail and probably die, and she feels that this is probably a punishment for Lucius botching the prophecy mission. So, Narcissa is in a tight spot. She doesn't want to anger Voldemort any further, but she also wants to protect Draco. So, she goes to Snape to ask for help. And this is an important first step, because even though she's getting help to carry out Voldemort's evil plot, Narcissa is defying Voldemort in order to do so, which both Bellatrix and Snape warn her is a really dangerous choice. But Narcissa values Draco's life above everything else, above her own safety, but also above her loyalty to Voldemort. She tells her sister that there's nothing that she won't do to protect Draco, which echoes Lily's love and sacrifice for baby Harry, and also contrasts pretty strongly with Lucius, who has not made Draco a #1 priority in the series so far. And I think we have to take Narcissa seriously, and so does Bellatrix. If there's literally nothing she won't do, if her ideology and alliances come second to her love for Draco, then she could ultimately even change sides, if that protects him better. And so this relatively smaller choice here sets up Narcissa's actions at the end of Book 7. Her love for Draco really does trump her loyalty to and fear of Voldemort. This love causes her to take actions that ultimately serve Harry's interests directly. And it's that combination of her love for her son, which is greater than her loyalty to Voldemort, and her actions that help Harry, which together allow Narcissa to be redeemed, in a narrative sense, even though we have no reason to believe that she's actually become any less horrible and pure-blood supremacist than she is later in these chapters at Madame Malkin's. Snape is another example. There are entire books about his redemption arc, and I want to save a longer discussion of him for later. But just briefly, Snape's redemption arc is also driven by loving someone else more than he fears and is loyal to Voldemort, even though that someone isn't Harry. And again, his love for someone else leads to redemption in the way that it motivates him to look out for and help Harry. So Narcissa and Snape represent the formula of helping Harry, plus demonstrating love for another, equals redemption. And this makes sense. Harry's the hero, the protagonist, the narrative perspective, so being redeemed is pretty tightly wound up with the degree to which the character stops thwarting him and starts helping him on his quest. And then showing love for another person is both a fairly universal baseline for being a decent human being, and it's also an essential theme of the series. But not all redemption arcs in the series fit this formula. For example, Draco gets a redemption arc, and it's connected to his actions toward Harry specifically, but I don't know that I'd say he's motivated by love. So maybe it's his mother's love and the way that Draco functions in her redemption arc that gives him a boost. Kreacher is an interesting contrast to Draco. He too was loved by someone who defied Voldemort as a result of that love, and he too eventually takes actions in support of Harry, who is now his master. But I'm not sure I'd say that Kreacher gets a redemption arc. Maybe that's because Kreacher is constrained by the magic that requires him to serve Harry, so the element of free choice is less clear. You might disagree. I'd be interested to hear whether you think that Kreacher gets a redemption arc. But let's turn to two characters who only meet one of the two pieces of the formula and don't get redemption arcs. So first, Wormtail. Wormtail is never motivated by love. He's always motivated by fear. In general, his loyalty is to whoever's most powerful and will protect him. And everybody on both sides hates him for this. It's worth noting that Wormtail makes huge sacrifices for Voldemort and is probably the Death Eater who's most responsible for his return. He finds undead Voldemort, sets up the whole Barty Crouch Jr. plan, is Voldemort's 24-hour nurse for a year, does the revival magic in the graveyard, and cuts off his own arm as part of the process. He was also the one who gave up the Potter's location in the first place. The fact that this backfired when Harry was a baby, and that the graveyard scene didn't end in Harry's death, those aren't actually Wormtail's fault. As far as services rendered, he's been all in for Voldemort. But he's still despised by Voldemort and the other Death Eaters because they recognize that he's a coward. And the text itself invites us to take that perspective and to despise Wormtail not so much because he's evil. He's betrayed Harry's parents, killed 13 Muggles, framed Sirius, killed Cedric, raised Voldemort from the dead. But the reason we're invited to hate him is because he's pathetic and motivated by fear. So Wormtail does not get a redemption arc. And this is notable because, like Draco, his actions do eventually benefit Harry, so he has got that part of the equation, even if, also like Harry, he's not motivated by love for someone else. So why doesn't this count? Why isn't Wormtail, if not a murderer, because that's definitely a step too far, why isn't he to some extent redeemed? Are his actions, like Kreacher's, not unambiguously a result of free choice? Or is it too late for Wormtail to redeem himself? Or is redemption just not a storyline that's available to characters depicted as weak? And if so, why not? The other major Death Eater character in Chapter 2 is Bellatrix Lestrange. And she also doesn't get a redemption arc, even though she's got one half of the equation going. So, Bellatrix, notably, does not seem to be mentally unstable in Chapter 2. I always think of her as insane and attribute this to her time in Azkaban with the Dementors, but in Chapter 2 she's eccentric and she's combative, but she seems to be sane. Bellatrix wants to prevent Narcissa, who she calls Sissy, from going to Snape for two pretty good reasons. One, Narcissa's not supposed to talk about the plan to anyone. And two, Bellatrix doesn't trust Snape. In fact, she believes that Voldemort is wrong in trusting him. And Bellatrix has a pretty interesting relationship with Voldemort. Compared to the other Death Eaters, she is more motivated by love of Voldemort than fear of him. I think it's safe to say that Bellatrix loves him more than anyone else does. And it appears to be a romantic love, possibly sexual love, certainly an obsessive love, though she's also married to another fanatical Death Eater. But loving Voldemort and being the most loyal Death Eater is a big part of Bellatrix's identity. And at the end of the First Wizarding War, it caused her to act in a totally un-Slytherin way. It's interesting to me that Voldemort requires absolute loyalty from his Death Eaters, but he's dealing with a group of people who are almost all sorted into Slytherin, which means they're likely to be strategic, cunning, and self-serving. In the Order of the Phoenix, Phineas tells Harry, "We Slytherins are brave, yes, but not stupid. For instance, given the choice, we will always choose to save our own necks." Snape, too, expresses this in conversation with Bellatrix. He says that after Voldemort's fall, he acted in his own self-interest by staying at Hogwarts, and he doesn't understand why she didn't do this too. Instead, Bellatrix wound up in prison because of her loyalty to Voldemort, which is really more of a Hufflepuff or a Gryffindor move. Slughorn tells Harry a few chapters later that Hogwarts houses usually go in families, but he names Sirius as an exception. Tonks, as part of the Black family, is an exception too, sorting into Hufflepuff. So maybe Bellatrix isn't completely different from her cousin and her niece. She has that really strong urge toward complete loyalty that we also saw in Sirius. This also highlights how strong the pureblood supremacy thing must be in sorting students into Slytherin, that it trumped that quality of loyalty that's so intensely present in Bellatrix. And it's not just loyalty to Voldemort. Bellatrix, whose whole identity revolves around loving Voldemort, she's the most loyal Death Eater. She's spent almost 15 years in Azkaban for him. Bellatrix actually loves Narcissa more. She tries to stop Narcissa from going to Snape. She knows that asking for his help outside of Voldemort's wishes is defying Voldemort, and she clearly doesn't care about Draco himself. But Bellatrix doesn't report this to Voldemort. Instead, she seals their secret unbreakable vow. Because even Bellatrix loves someone more than Voldemort. This love for someone else does not earn Bellatrix a redemption arc. She continues to oppose Harry and never takes any actions that help him. And ultimately, helping Harry seems to be a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for a character to get a redemption arc in this series. But this depiction of Bellatrix's love for Narcissa has another purpose, besides merely humanizing her and making her more complex. It tells us that there may be a lot of Death Eaters who aren't 100% loyal to Voldemort. Just in Chapter 2, we've seen 3 of them, including the Death Eater who counts herself as Voldemort's #1 fan. In all 3 of these cases, the Death Eater in question loves someone else more than they fear or are loyal to Voldemort. Dumbledore has told Harry that because Voldemort doesn't experience love himself, he always underestimates its significance to other people, and this is why his attempt to kill baby Harry failed. But he also doesn't seem to be aware of the ways that love within his own Death Eater organization could jeopardize his plans. And honestly, it's not that surprising. Not only is Voldemort cruel and vengeful, which inspires fear, but not love or trust, but also he was gone for 14 years. A lot of the Death Eaters thought he was dead, and they moved on, had families, developed other priorities, while Voldemort remained static, stuck in a moment 14 years before and obsessed with the baby who thwarted him. Very last person I want to touch on is Fudge. He doesn't get a redemption in these chapters, but he is also humanized, and maybe we might feel some pity for him. In Chapter 1, everything is falling apart. Fudge has been ousted. How? We don't know. It's government magic. And now he's reduced to being some sort of silly and harmless errand boy for the new Minister for Magic. It might even be possible in those moments to forget that he was heading toward full authoritarian rule in the last book, now that he's no longer a direct threat to Harry nor an indirect threat through Umbridge. But it does seem like kind of an abrupt shift, and I think it might be essential that we view this chapter through the perspective of the British Prime Minister, rather than through Harry's perspective. The Prime Minister is a career politician who may have some similar values and priorities, whereas Harry is a person who has no reason to have any warm feelings at all toward Fudge. Alright, that's all from me today. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.